welcome to our broadcast. I'm your co-host, Michael Lange, along with Dr. Barbara Cannon, and this is Oakland Is. Today we're going to get a chance to talk about the original people here, not only in California, but in what is now the United States of America, and that's the Native American population. And with us is a special guest, Ms. Charlie Toledo. And I want to welcome you to the program. And Dr. Cannon, it's good to see you again.
You too.
We're back.
Yes.
And why don't we just start and find out, I'm trying to get a state of the state address, if you will.
A state of the state.
Or the health card check and see, kind of check in and maybe talk about some of the myths, some of the facts that describe best the American Indian or the Native American or whatever name is best that describes.
I think what you're hitting on right now is a really confusing point. People don't know what to call Native Americans.
Yeah.
And the federal government still refers to Native people as Indian people. And so all the federal programs, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health, they still use those terms. And the federal government isn't going to change anytime soon. So you still are referred to, Native people are still referred to as Indians.
So the preferred word are words.
I think it just depends on the person. What I notice in Northern California now, it's mostly gotten slang, most young Native people, they call themselves Indian, and it's N-D-N, and then that's actually how it's spelled, capital N-D-N. Indian. Hey, Indian, wake up. They say stuff like that. And so that's, and then there's another word is Jine, because then the slang is Injun, and then it somehow got slanged down to Jine. And that's how a lot of young Native Americans refer to themselves as Jine. Oh, he's jined up, or and then come over here. But that's something within the culture.
And how about indigenous? Is that ever used?
I think that's the term I use. I think because of the global ramifications, and that I look at the indigenous issue globally instead of just nationally, and that's the term is indigenous.
Let me just ask a kind of an overarching question, and just with respect to religion. We had the Great Flood, you know, that's in the Bible and all of that. How does that factor into the history that the
Native Americans,
that the indigenous people would tell? Is it similar, or is it completely different?
It's completely different. In the United States, there's over 500 different tribes.
500?
500 different tribes. So that's 500 different stories. And just like we were talking about how in the UN now that's put linguistically, the tribes were language-based. The tribe, what defines a tribe is they all speak the same language. And then a tribe is made up of bands. And then bands are made up of clans. Clans are family groups. And clans have names, bands have names, and tribes have names. So that, and then there's dialects within the different bands, and then slangs within the clans, which is what I'm describing to you. That's almost a kind of a regional colloquialism, saying Indian or Jine. Those are language shifts that have occurred within this region of Northern California. So when you're asking questions about the stories of origin within the indigenous tribes, there's over 500 stories. There's probably more like 1,000 stories. And the different parts of North America and United States, of course, would have different stories.
It was so interesting hearing you talk about the written word and how to get permission to put things in writing, because the oral tradition is very strong, but also validation of what is real and what's not real.
Right, and that's what we were talking about earlier, that I got permission to start sharing stories that I knew from hanging out with elders just in the last 10 years. Well, actually since 1992, so that's whatever, 15 years now. But before that, I was telling, when I started hearing the stories that I share with you, because I was going on a lot of road trips and coming back into my roots, because my people, you know, I was assimilated, and then we did a voluntary migration to Southern California. I did a voluntary migration in 1972 up to Northern California, and then that's when I started being around California, Northern California Native Americans, and that's the tribes that I'm the most familiar with, even though my ancestry goes back in New Mexico, but that was too displaced and dislocated.
But you're working with something in the Napa area called the Susquehanna Intertribal Council. That's where a lot of your work is going on?
That's where, most of all my work is right now, the last, since 1992.
So the concentration in that area is because?
That's where I live, and also Napa is the oldest inhabited place in North America, and the tribes, the indigenous people from that region are terminated remember we talked about there's 5 different ways to refer to Native people, and one is terminated, another's exterminated, assimilated, unrecognized, and federally recognized land-based tribe.
Yeah.
And so in California, pre-European contact, there was over 300 California tribes, language groups in California, 300 different tribes. And then post-colonial time now, right now, at current time, there's 103 tribes. And so that's about 2% of the population. And the life expectancy of a Native American in 2008 is 48 years of age.
Wow.
That's the life expectancy of a Native American in the United States right now.
Is that because of stress, mental health issues?
It's because of the high rate of teenage suicide. It's a high rate of alcohol-related auto deaths. And yeah, I think then the stress, just a really low life expectancy. When I first started getting re-involved with my culture, it was 52. And so the life expectancy has dropped
It has went
in the
backwards.
last 10 years.
It's so interesting when you mentioned all of those categories. There were about 5. The first one you mentioned was terminated, then one was called
Exterminated.
exterminated. Would you mind sharing what those mean, the different ones?
Are you talking from a federal government point of view?
Well,
I'm
The
talking from a
definition?
federal government point of
Okay.
view. Those are the
Those are
5
all-
terms.
Oh.
Those are the federal terms when talking about indigenous population within the United States. Exterminated means that they were deliberately, maliciously, with forethought and planning,
Yeah.
killed.
Right.
And they thought exterminated like you would a rat
Yeah.
or a mouse or some kind of a pest. Terminated means that the tribe, that there were still survivors left, but they weren't cohesive enough to keep their land base or to be as a tribe. And then the next one is assimilated. And like I was speaking, that my people, the only reason I'm here is because my people ran faster than the guys with the guns, you know.
Yeah.
So then that was a forced assimilation. Because if we would have stayed where we were, we would have been dead. I would have been dead.
Right.
My line would be dead. So then I'm assimilated. And then there's unfederally recognized, because in the United States, when they started trying to acknowledge the tribes after they had scattered everybody and forced people and ran people out of everywhere, then they came in and started trying to take a census and keep track of people. And in California, that was in the mid-1800s. And that brings me back to that first question that you brought up, which I'm still going to answer because I think it's
Sure.
really interesting.
Yeah.
But in the United States, what happened in increments across the United States. So what happened on the East Coast happened 500 years ago. So Native people on the East Coast have had 500 years to recover from European contact. In California,
Yeah.
the tribes have had less than 100 years to recover. And most people don't realize that as late as 1972, not California, but Native people were still being relocated around in the United States. And that's why California has the largest population of Native people in the U.S., because as late as 1972, they were still relocating tribal people out of Montana and South Dakota, North Dakota, and bringing them into Oakland,
Yeah.
Los Angeles, and San Jose.
How does the reservation concept work? I mean, do you have to go to this place? I mean,
You used to have to. And again, because, you know, the stories, I'm going to answer them. You can see why
Yes.
it's easier to answer regionally.
Yes.
And I'm going to refer to Northern California because that's where we are. But it's going to have a different answer in every different state and every different part of the state.
Yeah.
Because the Europeans came in from the East Coast, they came east, and then South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, those are really barren, harsh places. So they just kind of passed through. And the tribes there were able to stay on their original land bases and thereby protect their language, protect their culture. And that's why when people think Indian, they think teepee. That's the Lakota tribes. The Europeans didn't hardly do anything to them because they were in really destitute places. The Europeans didn't want where they were.
Yeah.
So then they moved south and moved through Texas and, you know, New Mexico and Arizona. Well, those are really harsh places too, where Native people had the water and all they had to keep Native people from the water. But places like Georgia, North Carolina, you know,
Yeah.
northern parts of Texas, and then, of course, California.
Yeah.
There's lots of water and lots of food. And so what happened in all the different regions in relationship to the European contact was really different. And then again, that it happened in California last. And by the time the Europeans came to California, they were really good at killing Indians.
Very good at killing.
Yeah.
Indians.
Now-
They
now,
were
Chief-
deliberately, maliciously, with forethought
Yeah.
and planning, killing Indians. And by the time they got to California, they were saying that Native people were not human. They were not human. And so they got paid. People got bounties. Used to get a quarter for a male's head, a dime for a woman's head, and a nickel for a kid's head at the scalp. You'd bring in their scalp. And those pictures of the Indian head that are on the nickel, those are the pictures that were put up on trading post stores to show that they bought Indian heads. And then, of course, it gets hard to carry a whole big head around. So that's when they just started scalping. And that's a reverse where they say that the story, the way it comes through in Hollywood, is that the native people were scalping the Europeans. It was the other way around. The Europeans were scalping the Indian people, and they were being paid to do that. And how many scalps they brought in, that's how much they get paid. And usually by, again, the time they got to California, they wouldn't even waste, and this is written in stories. You can look back to histories. You can look to encyclopedias as late as 1930s, and they will refer to Native people as vermin. And they didn't want to waste a bullet on the children, so they just smashed their heads against a wall or a rock.
How does all of this translate for you today? How does it make you feel? Is there any peace that you can find in all of this? What has happened to the indigenous people?
I think that when we go, and this brings us back to our stories of origin, it's always interesting to me that Europeans will refer to their Bible and then they'll refer to native myths. And so I just like to tell people, well, your myth, you know, the one that you wrote down. Our myths are an oral tradition. But the stories of origin, that the native people, indigenous people knew that the Europeans were coming. We were all told. And most of the people, and especially you see this in the Southwest, but that's even in this region of California, that people were told through different ways that the others were coming, and they had the opportunity to leave this dimension. And a lot of them did, actually, most of them.
Leave this dimension?
Dimension meaning the physical plane
this
of the
third dimension that we're in here.
And,
the third dimension.
Well, what are the first two dimensions? I guess is a
well, the
good
first
question.
dimension's hell, but you know, then you ascend and you go fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh dimensions are the dimensions that you can still experience and stay in a physical body. So there's stories like that. There's lots of stories, and then sometimes the stories when they talk about Cortez coming into Mexico, that the indigenous people thought that he was a god and they bowed to him. There's stories. They knew that this guy was going to come on this four-legged with eyes that were blue like the sky. He came from the sky and he was coming to eat them. And there was nothing that they could do to resist that. So when they saw him, they weren't bowing to him. They were bowing to their destiny. And that was a foretold destiny. And the ones that stayed behind knew that that's what they were going to be looking at.
So where does this spirit, there's a spirit that we're speaking about, I sense that there's a greater all-knowing, omnipotent, quote, great spirit. Where is that as it relates to, say, religion? Or is it different?
I think we don't have religion, and I think that's the biggest shift between Aboriginal people or indigenous people and then European people or industrialized people. Because industrialized people think of religion, and that's kind of like one mandate. And in most indigenous cultures, at least in North America, but I've done a lot of world travel like we were talking about, and I've been in Africa and, you know, Australia and New Zealand and stayed with the indigenous people in South America. And most people, indigenous people, we don't have a religion, that each person has their own belief system and that we share it and we have our own understanding because we all come in with different gifts. We have different understanding of what we're supposed to be doing here on this earth, and so that's what information we have. And so one person isn't wrong and the other person right. And people never used to kill each other about different belief systems.
So then in terms of the indigenous people, do they ever come together in terms of solidifying some of those beliefs?
Well, if we go to what we're doing as an organization with some of those pictures, what Susquehanna Intertribal Council is doing in part of the recovery, this was one of our first steps of recovery. This is our first public gathering, if you focus on that picture. That we gathered in Napa Valley, and Napa Valley, like I said, is one of the oldest inhabited places, and this is archaeologically proven. 60,000 years indigenous people lived in the Napa Valley. And in less than 25 years, the culture, that's a terminated tribe. So in 1993, when we were doing public gatherings, what we refer to as, what this is a big time. California is a big time bringing together the tribes to see who survived the winter or who survived the European contact. And when we were doing this, it was the first time that Native people were gathering in the Napa Valley since the big massacres and mass murders of the indigenous people. And just like you look at this picture, this one is awesome because it shows the strength. And because they're wearing feathers, that represents the deer, and the horns that they have is the deer, and then the feather, that's a flicker feather that's sacred, and then the turkey feather is very sacred to California tribes, Northern California tribes.
And why their eyes closed,
And because
covered?
when we dance, we're dancing in prayer, and that's ceremony to the Creator and for the people and to the Creator. And so we become anonymous. And so you don't look to the people around. You're supposed to be looking inside of yourself. You lose your personal identity, and you become really what you're dancing. You become the deer. You become the turkey. You become the spirit of what you're representing. And that picture, I love that picture because it's so strengthful. But that's the traditional regalia. And I think most people don't realize that California tribes have preserved their languages and their traditions, but just had to go into hiding. And it's only been in the last 10 years that they've come out of hiding. And that's what we were talking about, that I didn't have permission from elders to share information like I'm sharing today. Because I used to ask my one friend when she was telling me a lot of information, we'd be on a lot of road trips together, and I'd say, you need to write a book. And she goes, no. You know, those white people, she says, just let them, they made up the lie, let them eat it. Let them eat that lie. And we didn't have permission to share. But the reason was because if people dressed like that, they were killed. And the ones that survived and the ones that kept the traditions alive, they did that because they went into hiding. And just like I said, my ancestors survived because they ran. The California tribes in this part of California, the ones that survived and the traditions survived because the people that had them hid them. And if they hadn't hid them, they would have been killed. And so when we were gathering for the first time, Susquehanna Intertribal was bringing Native people back to the surface and having it be shown. A lot of the elders were saying, you're going to get our kids killed. And that's hard to deal with, you know, that's scary. And I was thinking, I think it's going to be safe. I think it's going to be okay, but I really didn't know. And unfortunately, the first time we were gathering on the campus, Napa Valley campus, which is where General Vallejo camped when they started the slaughter of the Napa Valley tribes, and that's why we wanted to do ceremony there to begin. We wanted to begin where it began. You know, okay, this is where the killing started. This is where it stops. This is where the renewal and the rebirth and the resurfacing of all this beautiful spiritual life resurfaces. And unfortunately, the police academy that's at Napa College, they always were practicing out on the field where we were going to do our big time. And they weren't supposed to come out there. They were supposed to do their practice at another field. But they came with their guns, marching out that day. And some of the elders that were sitting around thought, oh, here they're coming. They just thought, oh, here they're coming. They didn't even question that those men with guns were coming to round us up and shoot us.
Now, there's something called DQ University. Is that Napa Valley?
No, DQU is, I was on the board of trustees there for about 7 years, and unfortunately it's going through a really rough time right now, but that is a Native American university just west of Davis on Road 13. And unfortunately, in the last few years, they've gone through a lot of turmoil, and their accreditation was lost, and they're still, but it was land that was reclaimed. We could go back to 1972. Were you guys in the Bay Area? Either one of you?
Yes.
Fourth generation.
Oh, okay, so then you know about Alcatraz, when the indigenous people took over Alcatraz. And that was around some of those forced relocations that were occurring in the late 1970s. And they were going out to remote reservations and telling Indian youth, mostly male, but some women too, but mostly it was men, that they were going to get job training and housing if they came to the West Coast. So they gave them a bus ticket to Los Angeles, San Jose, or Oakland, and their idea of housing was a 1-week residence in a motel and a job referral to the unemployment office. That's what they got when they landed here. Well, their families back home were so poor, they had no way, and most of the tribes don't, still now, a lot of tribes don't have phones. So they couldn't phone up and say, hey, send me a bus ticket because this sucks and I want to come home. And so what was happening within 18 months of those kids getting off the bus, most of them were dead. Alcohol-related suicides, car deaths, because they weren't used to the traffic patterns and the density of population and just not knowing what to do. So that's when what was that name that you asked if that was somebody?
The DQ University?
No, not the DQ, but
Richard Oakes?
Richard Oakes.
Yeah, Richard
was
Oakes,
one of
yeah,
the people
sure.
that they saw that happening, and they saw these kids just being really like roadkill, you know, and so they started the Oakland Friendship House. And they started just scanning the bus stations, and when they'd see Indian kids coming off the buses, they'd just get them and bring them to the Friendship House. And then if they wanted to stay, they'd try to help them get into school or get in some kind of training program, and they'd house them there at the Friendship House until they could get settled. Or if they felt like they wanted to go home, they'd get them the money to go back home
So
on
what
the
you're
bus.
describing, it would be very interesting to know if today, the present day, looking at how Native Americans or indigenous people work on an interest of the community, the
Right.
community. How do they do that? Is it a systematic process now?
Now it is. It's California Rural Indian Health. There's a Rural Indian Health. It's under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then that's under the Department of Interior, and that's pretty systematic or systemic. Initially, the BIA, and that's why it wasn't healthy for California Indians, is they were Indians that had already been urbanized or assimilated in the East Coast, and they were the ones that had the government jobs here in California. So nationally, they were making decisions that benefited the Eastern tribes, not California
Not
people.
California.
And that's where California was getting the really raw end of the BIA until very recently.
Recently.
Yeah,
So now,
like
if
the
you-
last 10 years.
So starting with this recent time and looking at Napa and what's happening in California, well, could you just kind of give us a state of how things occur in terms of benefiting the people, in terms of education and opportunities for jobs, et cetera?
Well, again, that varies from person to person.
But I mean, if there's a collective at all.
There is the collective. There's California Rural Indian Health is set up to provide Indian health, and that's funded by the federal government. And then it's to make sure Indian health is available to urban Indians and Native people living on reservations. A lot of the tribal groups have taken over their own Indian health
Okay.
because they didn't want it administered at a state level.
And how about education?
Education, it varies from tribe to tribe, and a lot of times there's 102 answers to that question,
Yes.
or 200 maybe, depending on the range to a public school.
Right.
You know, some of the reservations are rancherias. In California, you have rancherias because it's under 100 acres. It's a rancheria,
Okay.
which is most of that 102 that I talked about. Probably 70 of them are rancherias, and then maybe I don't even think there's 30. It's probably 10 reservations. I'm thinking that there's the 5 tribes down south, and then there's Hoopa and Round Valley. So maybe there's less than 10 reservations, and the rest are rancherias under 100 acres. So some of the remote rancherias along the coast, they might have a family groups of maybe 13 people, and then they're a 2-hour ride to a school. So they'll have their own little school right there on the rancheria.
So what's happening in the Napa area in terms
Well,
of...
Napa, remember, the tribe's terminated, so there's no land-based tribe.
But are
And-
there any indigenous people there?
Yes, and that's why we started our council, but they were scattered. And a lot of them are what we call, I'm referred to as out-of-state Indian, you know, because I'm from out of state.
Right.
And
Out of
then,
the state of Napa.
of California.
Ah,
The state
okay.
of California. Napa's a city or a county.
Sure.
You can see this is really confusing, and
Yeah.
a lot of times when I talk about this stuff, I have an eraser board, and I'm writing stuff down. And then it's a lot of information. If you're not familiar with it, it's very technical information that most people can't keep up with. So,
But in terms of
If you
the
guys don't-
presence, a collective presence, there are persons who
So
are,
in-
do they go to school? Do they have?
right. Yeah, pretty much all Native people are living in houses, wearing clothes, and going to either the public school or some remote rural school.
Right. Yeah, one of the things I'm really interested in is because when I worked at Merritt College, we had a very active Native American association in
Yes, they
student
still do,
government.
yeah.
And they had a powwow every year at the college or somewhere near in proximity. And then down the hill, the Ohlone people were along that area of near Merritt College, and Karl Monk Elementary School was down the hill. So I understand that a lot of this area was all Ohlone territory as well.
Right. Oakland and San Francisco was Ohlone, and Ohlone is a terminated tribe.
Meaning that they're all gone.
No, see, remember,
No land base.
no land base,
They're
and they're
not
not
connected.
federally recognized.
Okay.
That means the federal government, when they terminated them, they said there's no tribe there, there's no people, and then they crossed them off the list.
Yeah.
So terminated tribes get no health benefits, no education benefits. They can't set up a casino anywhere. That's why there's not a casino in San Francisco. And
They can go to school.
Well, they just like regular
get it,
citizens.
yeah.
They're assimilated, but that was a forced assimilation. Once the tribe is terminated, and then the people are scattered,
I see.
then they just are trying to get a living however they can. And just like I said, there's as many stories as there are people.
Right.
That would happen in the different
we only have a couple of
families.
minutes left, but maybe you could kind of tie in all of this. Where do you see all of this going? Is this
I think
creating something
I think the
new?
most important thing, and that's what we're doing as an organization, and that's why we've bought a land base. You know, we just purchased land. Initially, we thought somebody, because part of the spiritual health, I think of everybody in North America, and that goes back to your story of creation myths, that we were told that these others were coming. They were coming because they were cursed. They were in pain, and they were sick, and they were coming here, and what was going to heal them was the blood of the native people. And then at one point, when it would appear as if, how they say, is all the people were gone, they would rise up from the west, which is bringing us to the Alcatraz and DQ. Those things are all wrapped up, but we didn't have enough time to get to all that. They would rise up from the west and spread back to the east, and that all the people on what we call Turtle Island, North America, would be saved.
Well, we need to probably close here, but I remember there was a gentleman by the name of Chief Seattle, for which Seattle, Washington is named, and he said to the, quote, white man at that time that you will find out in the end that we are brothers after all. I imagine there was a physical battle that was taking place at the time. They were exterminating the Native Americans. Can you speak to that we are brothers after all?
Well, I think that what you had said earlier, that there's really no races, you know, that we all have red blood. And then what Chief Seattle, in a lot of his words, he wasn't even just talking about humans, he was talking about all life.
Yes.
All life is connected. And that we are, you know, we can kill the mosquito or like the wing of the butterfly, you know, the flutter, that it changes things forever. And if you take out all the mosquitoes, like everybody says, I wish there were no mosquitoes.
We
well,
need
then there
them.
would be no frogs, there'd be no bats, there'd be no owls, there'd be no, all the different things. So what Chief Seattle, the essence is that we're all connected, that all life is connected. And I think what the industrialized people, Europeans, didn't understand, and still don't, are still struggling to understand, that all life is connected. And that if you kill any life, you're killing yourself.
Well, thank you for those wonderful words of wisdom. We've run out of time. It was fast. Very insightful, probably just scratched the surface, but I want to thank you for coming on the program. Perhaps we can do another program.
It needs to continue.
There's a lot of good questions here, and we'll see you all next time, next week, Oakland is, and until then, so long. And for Dr. Cannon and for Charlie Toledo, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.